him. And then finally, Saul dies in a battle, and David comes to be the king. And David then does what the king is supposed to do. And he starts fighting the wars that God asked him to fight. Eventually, even at this point, the Amorites have turned evil against the nation of Israel. And so David fights against them, and he wipes them out. In chapter 10, he's just demolishing them. He's finding success everywhere. In chapter 5, he's finally, in 2 Samuel chapter 5, David is finally fully established as the king. And as the king, he's got a palace. He's got vanquished foes. He's got peace everywhere. And when you get to chapter 7, it says that now that David has peace on all sides, God comes to him and he makes him this promise. He says, there will always be a descendant of yours on the throne of my people. And David says, who am I to deserve such things? But there's one thing that David did in the midst of all that. He acquired a lot of wives. He got a lot of women. And he got a lot of those women pregnant. And he got a lot of kids as a result. Back then at the time, it was considered kosher for kings to have tons and tons of women. Solomon, a king to come later, had like 700 wives. And so, I mean, how do you even keep track? I don't know. But so David had like 10 at this point in time, and it's kind of growing, his family's growing. But we come into the story in chapter 11, where David is saying, I'm done. All the hard work has been accomplished. I've got a palace. And now it's a little bit of maybe some time to relax. Take a look at what it says. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Now there's a hint there of something going on. The first line of that paragraph says, it's the springtime, and in the springtime, it's the job of the king to go to war. Because after all, wintertime is not a time to fight and maintain an army. But when the springtime comes, now there's food that's just growing wild, and you can grab wheat, and you can raid fields, and you can do that kind of stuff. So in the springtime, you can maintain an army. In the springtime, kings go to war. But David's like, you know what? I've done all my work. I'm just going to send other people out there. I'm going to stay here in Jerusalem. Write this down. It's as if David is saying, it's time for me. He has a moment of me, I would call it. A small moment where David says, it's really just about me right now. I know it's springtime. This is the best time to go to war. This is the best time to continue the work that God has asked me to do. The Ammonites aren't fully defeated yet. They're still going on with their thing. And in fact, in chapter 10, you find out that they're still waging war against the Israelites. There's still a problem. David knows he's got a job to do, but instead of doing it himself, like he did in chapter 10, he sends Joab out there as his commander. He says, it's time for me. Now, how could a small decision like that have any kind of ramifications? I mean, that's not a big deal. He's the king. He's the one who has the authority and the right to tell other people where to go and what to do. I mean, that's his right, isn't it? He's the king. He can do these kinds of things. Why should he be responsible for carrying on this task of warfare? Keep reading. One evening, David got up from his bed. What? One evening, David got up from his bed. That means he was sleeping during the day. Okay, so we can give him a little bit of credit here, just real quick, because this is the springtime, and in Israel during the springtime, there was something called the Scirocco. Not the car, it's a wind that would fly through, and the Scirocco wind would come out from the eastern part of Asia, and it would sweep through Israel, bringing this intensely hot wind with it. It would just be intensely hot. And so a lot of people back there in that time, during the spring, they would simply sleep during the day, let the wind come through, and then they would do what they needed to do in the evening. And as a king, if he's not at war, he needs to do kingly things, making decisions for people, things like that. And so he sleeps during the day, and then it's evening time. He gets up, but does he do king stuff? No, check it out. He walks around on the roof of the palace. And the only other time in the Bible we find a king walking around the roof of his palace, the only other time we see a king walking around the roof of his palace is Nebuchadnezzar when he's standing on his palace roof and he's looking out at all he surveys and he says, look at everything I've done. And he's prideful, and God strikes him into the form of an animal of some kind, gives him some type of disease, makes him go crazy for 7 years because of his pridefulness. And now David is doing this. He's on the roof wandering. Well, what bad can happen from wandering around a roof? It's just a tiny, small, insignificant decision to go up and spend some time surveying his kingdom, right? Keep going. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. Oh, that's just a tiny, insignificant thing to notice. Okay, there's a naked woman in my view. It's just, right, it's not a big deal for him to notice this. I mean, in this day and age, people needed to bathe out in the open so they could dry out sometimes, and this is the evening. She's just doing what's culturally acceptable back there. She's just bathing, but he sees it, and then the woman was very beautiful, which means he was paying attention to her. Well, that's just a small, insignificant decision to see a naked woman and to keep looking at her, right? I mean, that's just a small, insignificant, it can't lead anywhere, right? And then verse 3, David sent someone to find out about her. It just keeps getting worse. Then the man says, isn't this? Now, isn't this means don't you already know? Don't you already, David, you don't need to send me to get information about this lady. Don't you already know? Because he did. We'll find out in just a little bit. Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now, you don't know who Uriah is, but David did, because Uriah was one of his 30. David had 30 mighty men, the most important warriors in his entire army. The captains were called the 3. And then he had the 30. And Uriah is mentioned in that list. He was one of David's most valiant, most loyal fighting men. David knew him. David knew his wife. And the man says, don't you already know? Isn't that Bathsheba? Look at verse 4. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. The parentheses there says she'd purified herself from her uncleanness. That means that after a woman finished with her menstrual period, she had to spend 7 days in sort of ritual purification rites. So that means from the day she started her period to this moment right now, it's been about 14 days. About 10 to 14 days. That means she is ovulating. For those of you who are into the science, she's ready, and he sleeps with her. And then it says she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. So much of what David does here is just incredibly selfish. He's saying, isn't it time for me? Yeah, she's Bathsheba. She's Uriah's wife, but come on, isn't it time for me? After all the work I've done, isn't it time for me? She comes to him and she's married to a warrior. Don't ever believe that she's some passive person who's like, oh, I'm just so glad the king is calling me. No, she is an unwilling participant in this thing. If we were to explain this situation properly, we would probably use the word rape. This is not two consenting adults. This is a woman who is married to one of the toughest dudes in the entire land. And she is taken advantage of by a man who says, well, isn't it time for me? Keep going. After David finds out she's pregnant, he freaks out a little bit. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was. Let's just beat around the bush a little bit. How's Joab doing? how the soldiers were and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your own house and wash your feet." Metaphor for get a good bath, strip down. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. Maybe some nice basket of strawberries, with some chocolate and some bath salts. I don't know. But a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. An honorable man, keep going. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, "Haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. And my master Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, you who are now in a palace, feasting every day, not in a tent, not on the battle, but as sure as you live, I will not do such a thing." Uriah is living in a moment of surrender and submission, even to a leader who doesn't deserve it. Verse 12, then David says to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next 2 days. At David's invitation, he then ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. Even drunk, he doesn't go home. So David, at his wit's end, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. The irony is terrible. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Not just Uriah died, as if that weren't bad enough. Some of David's best men. See, the only way Joab knew he could get Uriah to go to that part, that stupid part of the battle, the only way he knew he could get Uriah to go there is if he sent other men there too. Because Uriah was a noble man. He was honorable. And if he saw other people in a very stupid situation, he would want to be there to rescue them. And so they die first. And eventually he does too. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you've finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up. And he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth?